A few years ago, I came across these photos for the first time. Well, I think it won't mean anything to you, but in fact, what we see on the screen are small pieces of pine and stains of blood that supposedly appeared on their own. Very, very strange. These photos were enough to pique my curiosity, and I decided to investigate. In fact, with a few clicks on the internet, I learned that these small pieces of bread are actually what we call hosts, and they are used during Catholic masses. Catholic masses, I think you know, at least by name. Yeah, whatever your religion or beliefs, I'm almost sure you've been to a mass at least once in your life. Maybe for a wedding or a funeral, or perhaps to the Christmas mass when you were little with your parents. You know, the somewhat long thing where we sit, then stand up, then sing, then sit down, then stand up again while others kneel, and when we're little we don't understand everything. We wait for it to pass by, looking at the paintings on the side or imagining that we're climbing the pillars. No, you've never done that? Anyway, by doing a bit of research, I understood that hosts are often made in monasteries by monks or nuns. In fact, the recipe is super simple. It's just wheat flour, water, and that's it. There is no yeast or sourdough, and basically that's what makes the host remain flat, creating a small white disc, but it doesn't rise like the baguettes or bread rolls that you are used to buying at the bakery, for example. But the more I progressed in my research, the more strange things accumulated. For example, I'm sure you didn't know that there was the element I'm going to talk about in Catholic churches. Well, when you enter a church, it's quite nice. The architecture, honestly, is often pretty stunning, and it's nice because when there's a lot of noise in the city, it's a calm and peaceful place, you know? I don't know if you've ever done that, but I used to enjoy going into churches in Paris between noon and 2. It was quite a relaxing atmosphere. The light from stained glass, the silence, the smell of candles, it's true that it's quite a cool place, you know? And have you ever paid attention to that little red light at the front? Now that I mention it, it rings a bell, right? Well, there is this little red light because right next to it, in the kind of golden box we call the tabernacle, which is locked, there is a sort of cup called a ciborium, and in this ciborium there are hosts, but hosts that we call consecrated hosts. So far, okay, cool, but you might say nothing extraordinary, and you might be wondering what this has to do with the photos I showed you at the beginning, but we'll get to that. And honestly, when I discovered what I will tell you soon, I was not done with my surprises. In fact, during the Mass, I realized it is the most important moment of the Mass for Catholics, where the priest takes a host and consecrates it. And in fact, after that specific moment, Catholics believe that the host is no longer bread, but actually becomes the person of Jesus himself. Really, it is not a symbol or an image. No, for Catholics, a consecrated host is not a piece of bread, but a real living person, the person of Jesus. In other words, God himself. So in fact, indeed, for Catholics, a consecrated host is not a sacred object, but Jesus himself, whom one can worship. Honestly, it's rarely discussed, but many believe every religious place, such as churches, mosques, synagogues, has a holy object. For Catholics, it's God himself present in every church. So I went to a church to see, and indeed you can see the small red light next to the tabernacle, which indicates that the consecrated host, meaning Jesus, is truly present in the tabernacle, in the small locked box. But then I wondered, how can Catholics believe in something so big? How can they believe that the bread actually becomes a person during the Mass, and that after the moment of consecration, host is no longer bread? As I am honest, I sought to seriously investigate without preconceived notions and grasp why Catholics believe in this. Basically, what are their reasons for believing that for them, the host truly transforms into God himself? Because I suppose they don't believe in this blindly, and they have good reasons to think it's true. Well, I hope. And in fact, the more I dug, the more answers I got, which in turn raised new questions, but I will come back to that. First of all, I noticed that the words the priest says during the Mass are the same words that Jesus said during his Last Supper. Indeed, the Gospels, which are the books that recount the life of Jesus, report this about Jesus' last meal. During the meal, Jesus indeed took bread and pronounced the blessing, broke it, and gave it to the disciples, saying, "Take, eat, this is my body." And I remind you that even if it may not seem so, the Gospels are actually very reliable documents for knowing the life of Jesus of Nazareth. Made a video about that which you can find on my channel. So anyway, the priest during the Mass, at a moment called the consecration, repeats these words, "This is my body given for you." And then he lifts the host like that, and the whole assembly bows their heads and prostrates, often on their knees, since I remind you that for them it is not bread, but truly Jesus who becomes really present right before them. And then the priest does the same with the chalice, which is the vessel that contains wine, and which truly transforms into the blood of Christ according to Catholics. Well, another thing I noticed that started to give me serious doubt, this transformation that supposedly occurs from bread to the flesh of Jesus is not visible. In other words, after the moment of consecration, the host still looks like a normal host. It still has the taste of bread, but it would no longer be bread, but Jesus himself is a transformation that would be invisible. Well, okay, why not? If God exists and Jesus is God, why not? He could do what he wants. But do we have strong reasons to believe that this would be true? Aside from you must believe, and this is where, my friends, it's going to get interesting. Who discovered the existence of something called Eucharistic miracles. Indeed, in fact, these are moments when consecrated hosts, precisely, would have transformed into clots of human flesh. So, it wouldn't happen at every Mass, but Catholics believe these are miracles God performs occasionally to show Jesus is present in the consecrated host even if unseen. Basically, the bread's transformation into Jesus, invisible, would be completely visible to strengthen the faith of the faithful who have some doubts. Well, I thought, okay, very well, we will investigate this and see what it's worth. Because frankly, I had never heard of it. And if it is true that bread transforms into human flesh without any action from man, without any deception, without any trickery, it would really be something crazy that would probably confirm the faith of Catholics. Firstly, why we call this Eucharistic miracles. In fact, it's because the other name for the consecrated host is the Eucharist. Eucharist comes from the Greek verb Eucharistine, which means to give thanks. The celebration of the Eucharist is therefore the Mass, when the faithful give thanks to God for the gift of his Son Jesus. Let's get to the heart of the matter. Have there really been miracles with consecrated hosts? When I started to look into this, I was extremely surprised by the abundant literature on this subject, while once again, no one talks about it. There is, for example, a young Italian teenager, Carlo Acutis, who died at 15 in 2006, who created a website listing over 100 Eucharistic miracles that are said to have occurred in history. His website, available in many languages, lists Eucharistic miracles from all times and in many different countries. Argentina, Austria, Belgium, Colombia, Croatia, Egypt, France, Germany, India, Italy, Mexico, Netherlands. In short, you understand the principle. Well, that doesn't mean that all these miracles are true. Obviously, we will take them one by one and see what they are really worth. But in any case, it means that Catholics claim quite a few. And I couldn't help but think, upon discovering the life of Carlo Acutis, that he was a young man filled with wisdom. He had quite a great maturity. For example, he said, "Happiness is the gaze turned towards God. Sadness is the gaze turned towards oneself." Or again, all are born as originals, but many die as photocopies. Or, find God and you will find the meaning of your life. The most astonishing thing is that when he learned he had leukemia in early October 2006, he received the news with a smile and in great peace. And he was even happy to die to go see his God who created him. An impressive strength of soul, that is the least I must admit. In short, when I discovered that there were dozens and dozens of charismatic miracles, I bought all the books I could on the subject, and I chose to condense everything for you in this video into the most comprehensive investigation possible. In this video, you will discover more than a dozen cases, and I think that, like me when I discovered all this, you will not be done with your surprises. And for those who don't know, in fact, this video is part of a series called 100 Unexplained Mysteries, a series where I examine the value of 100 phenomena that would be scientifically inexplicable. I covered the first and second mysteries in previous videos. Suggest watching them after this. And for this video, I have grouped all the cases I discovered into 5 inexplicable mysteries. Well, let's go. Third inexplicable mystery out of 100, the Eucharistic miracles in history. We will move through the centuries little by little in chronological order, and I will save the best for last. That is to say, the recent Eucharistic miracles, some of which may have occurred a few years ago or even a few months. But for now, we are between the 3rd and 5th centuries in Egypt. There, in the desert, lived monks who spent their days in prayer. It is said that an old monk, aged from the desert of Seth, where the San Macaire monastery of Sete is located, had a very weak faith and said, "The bread we eat is not truly the body of Christ, but a symbol." Other monks tried to convince him that he was mistaken and that the consecrated host was indeed the body of Christ. The monk acted and replied, "If a fact does not convince me, I will not be swayed." The other two replied, "This week we will pray to God about this mystery, and we believe that God will reveal it to us." The following Sunday, while they were at church during the Mass, they saw in place of the bread a child appear, and an angel descending from heaven holding a sword with which he sacrificed the child and poured the blood into the chalice. At this sight, the old monk was terrified and cried, "I believe, Lord, that your bread is the body." And then the flesh he had in his hand took on the appearance of bread. What I have told you is one of the oldest Eucharistic miracles that has come down to us. Because yes, when I started my research, I realized that Eucharistic miracles have existed for 2,000 years. Indeed, since the first Mass in history, celebrated by Jesus, there have been many around the world to strengthen the faith of the faithful. But I must be honest, this very old account seemed unconvincing to me. Did not want to challenge the faith of our ancestors, but but if I could have something a bit more substantiated, I would not have refused it. So I continued to dig. Well, I continue to present all this in chronological order, but I warn you, the further we go into the centuries, the more strange phenomena have intensified, with more and more traces and evidence that require explanations. I first discovered another case said to have occurred in Rome in 595. More interesting, we preserved the fragment of the host said to have transformed into human flesh. It is still visible today in Andex, Germany. Well, okay, that's already better. We have more traces. The piece of host is kept in a reliquary, which is a kind of sacred container, but since we cannot open it and verify if it is indeed flesh, it doesn't prove much. However, by continuing to dig, I finally came across an extremely interesting case. Today, when you enter the Church of St. Francis in Lanciano, in central Italy, you can read on a marble plaque, "A monk priest doubted the presence of the body of our Lord in the consecrated host. He celebrated Mass and, after pronouncing words of consecration, he saw the host transform into flesh and the wine into blood. All attendees witnessed the event." Interesting. The facts of this miracle date back over 1200 years, in the year 750. At first I thought, it's still quite old for it to be attested, but in fact, what I discovered blew me away. In the Catholic Church, several churches in the same territory are under the authority of someone called a bishop or an archbishop. And, 1970, the Archbishop of Lanciano requested that scientific analyses be conducted on the remains of the hosts. It is Dr. Eduardo Linoli, director of the Arezzo Hospital and professor of anatomy, chemistry, and clinical microscopy, who is selected to conduct a thorough examination of the samples. March 4th, 1971, the professor presents his findings. The pieces would indeed be pieces of flesh, more precisely pieces of myocardium, which is one of the heart muscles. The blood would be real human blood and of blood type AB. Well, so far, it's true that it's quite impressive, but perhaps our ancestors from the 8th century placed pieces of flesh they had collected from corpses in a reliquary. Nothing proves to us that it was indeed hosts at the beginning. On the other hand, the most surprising thing is that the pieces have been preserved for 1200 years, while the report specifies that no particular preservation technique was applied. That becomes really very strange, because the report states that under these preservation conditions, with all the bacteria present in the air, in a reliquary that is not airtight, unsealed, the pieces of flesh should have decomposed centuries ago. Normally, in just a few months or a few years, dead flesh left exposed to the air, like here, completely decomposes. That's not all. Where I literally bugged out, where no one can find an explanation is, hold on, that the blood contains all the elements of perfectly fresh human blood. I will try not to get too technical, but if you want, for blood analysis, we can do what is called an electrophoretic trace, which allows us to visualize all the proteins that should currently be in the blood. This was done for the samples of the Lanciano, and the proteins contained in the blood perfectly match those of normal fresh human blood. This scientific anomaly by itself was enough to draw all attention to the conclusions of Professor Eduardo Linoli. Could he have been mistaken? If Professor Linoli is telling the truth, then we are indeed facing a miracle in itself, an inexplicable mystery, that of a 1200-year-old clot, which not only has been preserved, but especially reacts like normal blood. Faced with such a mystery, in 1973, the High Council of the World Health Organization appointed a scientific committee to verify the conclusions of Professor Linoli. The work lasted 15 months. 500 examinations were conducted. All of the professor's results were confirmed. In the summary of the work of the WHO and the UN published in December 1976 in New York and Geneva, it was stated that science, aware of its limits, stops short of providing an explanation. Okay, so we clearly have something inexplicable. And for those who want to know more, go read this book by Bruno Samasiccia on the miracle of Lanciano. It shows in detail scientific blood analyses with all tables and technical details. It's not exciting, but at least it shows that it's really solid. But it's not over. I was really not at the end of my surprises. The more I advanced through the centuries, the more I saw that Eucharistic miracles were numerous and much more attested than I would have thought at first glance. Much harder to explain with simple science and a natural explanation. But come on, a few more examples before moving on to even more impressive and attested things. We have, for example, the miracle of Bolsena, still in Italy, which took place in 1264. A host would have almost burst into blood during a mass, to the point of splattering, if I may say so, even the linens and stones in the church. So much so that even today, there are still traces of blood on certain stones of the church, and we still have the cloth stained with blood. And then, from that time on, we begin to have written traces of accounts from people who were present at the Mass during the event. For example, we still have a parchment from the time of the miracle, recounting the events by a notary, Cesare Severo Durantino. As I mentioned in my first look at the mysteries on my channel, it is not because it is ancient that it is not verified. We know very well and precisely about things much older, such as the exact circumstances of Julius Caesar's death, for example. Therefore, the large number of Eucharistic miracles in history The variety of their manifestations and their locations on the planet cannot simply be brushed aside. We must confront reality and the evidence we have. Tried to do this in the investigation. Also, for the Eucharistic miracles, some have tried to explain the red stains that appear on bread, like in the photo in the introduction, and which I will return to, by the bacteria Serratia marcescens. It is a bacterium that forms a blood-red pigment and grows at room temperature on foods containing carbohydrates, such as sugars. These bacteria do indeed resemble blood, but for the Eucharistic miracles, when scientific studies have been conducted, we should not take the researchers for fools. They know how to recognize human blood and have sometimes been able, as in Lanciano, to be much more precise by indicating the blood type and even that it was a piece of heart. As for the miracle of Bolsena, traces of real blood, divided into plasma and serum, were indeed identified on the cloth of the relic through ultraviolet photographs during its restoration in early 2015. We have the Eucharistic miracle of Bordeaux, France, which took place on Sunday, February 3rd, 1822. That afternoon, at 4 p.m., in the chapel of a convent of nuns, the community of the Daughters of Loreto, there is a small ceremony during which the nuns adore what is called the Blessed Sacrament. The Blessed Sacrament is precisely the Eucharist that is exposed in what is called a monstrance, so that the faithful can adore it. Well, sorry, I know, that's a lot of complicated words. A priest, Father Delors, came to install the Blessed Sacrament, as only priests have the right to do so, and during the ceremony, which lasts about 20 minutes, suddenly an unusual phenomenon occurs. The assembly sees in the host the face of Christ, alive, moving, bowing, smiling. To be more precise, I will read you an excerpt from the priest's testimony. Because yes, in fact, we have preserved the written testimonies of 14 people out of the 21 who were present in the chapel at that time. And for those who would like to know more, this case is extremely well documented. You will find all the sources, for example in this book, accounts and testimonies of the events in Bordeaux 1822. So here is the account of the priest as he describes Jesus that he saw in the host. His figure was very white and represented a young man of about 30 years. Exceedingly beautiful, he was dressed in a dark red sash. He bowed from time to time to the right and in front. Struck by this miracle and unable to believe my eyes, I first thought it was just an illusion. But as the miracle continued and unable to remain in this uncertainty, I signaled to the child holding the censer to come closer. I asked him if he saw anything special. He replied that he had already seen the same miracle and that he was seeing it again. Well, I'm not going to read everything to you, it's long, but essentially all the people who looked at the host saw the person of Jesus inside very clearly. Honestly, when we read all the consistent testimonies, and you can do so if you wish, it is hard to believe that everyone would have lied. They are simple people, honest, who do not try to impress, but just to recount what they have seen in all simplicity. We have a fairly large variety of witnesses, because in addition to the nuns, we have an altar boy, students, and women who were not religious. And Father Delors was there then. He was not the usual priest who took care of the community. The hypothesis of a collective hallucination, I have already shown in previous investigations why this hypothesis cannot be possible. Moreover, there were other miracles where the face of Jesus appeared in the host. On January 26, 1902, in the Church of Saint-André, after a mass by Father Henri Lacombe, an adoration of the Blessed Sacrament occurred. So the adoration, as I was saying, is when the Blessed Sacrament is exposed to everyone's view in the host itself, so that all who wish can look at it, pray to it, adore it, as it is truly Jesus for them. And in this adoration, according to numerous witnesses, the face of Jesus appeared in the host before disappearing at the end of the adoration. We know this because when the face appeared, the news spread like wildfire across the entire island in a few minutes, so that a large crowd, including journalists and people from the capital Saint-Denis, came to the church to see the miracle. It is estimated that several thousand people saw this miracle own eyes, which remained visible for several hours and were able to testify afterwards. Not convinced? Another phenomenon of this kind occurred even more recently and is even able to be photographed. It is May 5th, 2001 in Shiritakonam, India. The priest, Father Johnson Karur, would later say that when he opened the tabernacle where the monstrance was, he saw a figure resembling a human face on the host. I was very moved and asked the faithful to pray. I thought I was the only one who saw the face. Also, I asked the altar boy what he saw. He replied, "I see a figure of a man." I noted that the other faithful were looking intently at the monstrance. Adoration began, and as the minutes passed, the figure of the man became increasingly clear. I did not have the courage to speak and began to cry. After that, he called a photographer to capture this moment. And we still have the photos today. But anyway, I don't want to go on too long about these miracles in history. Already, because there are so many that I couldn't present them all to you. And I think anyway that all these charismatic miracles in history, especially that of the Lanciano, are enough to say that together, they indeed form a mystery, explicable by science. They are too numerous, and when we look into each case, we realize that the majority are very well established. after that, it's up to each person to form their own opinion. And anyway, you will see that there is even more impressive, the very recent and very well-established Eucharistic miracles that took place in the 21st century, just a few years ago. But before we look at them, let's first move on to our fourth inexplicable mystery out of 100, the unusual Eucharistic miracles. Because yes, a Eucharistic miracle is not always bread turning into a piece of flesh. It can be the face of Jesus appearing in a host, as in Bordeaux, India, or Réunion. But it can sometimes also be something much more spectacular. Come on, I'll show you the most original Eucharistic miracles that I found. Back a few years before the events in Bordeaux, you're still in France, but this time in the east, at the Abbey of Faverney on May 26, 1608. That night at 3 a.m., the one responsible enters the church to ring the bells to call the monks to prayer, which takes place at 3 a.m., is called the Office of Matins. But when he opens doors of the church, he sees thick smoke fills the central aisle. Fire is in progress and made significant progress. The fire seems to have started from the altar, the kind of table where priests say mass, and in this abbey is all wood. Indeed, the day before, the monks of the abbey had placed on the altar a monstrance containing, in a silver luna, 2 consecrated hosts. The candles set on either side of the monstrance must have been left lit by mistake, and after melting, they ignited the altar, then the church. The alarm is raised immediately. The monks arrive in a hurry and extinguish the fire. Then they try to recover some debris from the destroyed furniture in the still warm ashes. It is complete panic, as you can imagine. And yet, 2 miracles are about to happen. Amid the debris, between the burned linens and a half-melted candlestick, a monk discovers a letter from the Pope and a letter from the Archbishop of Besançon completely intact. Now, these 2 letters had been placed in front of the wooden altar, which completely burned. Their state of perfect preservation is therefore totally inexplicable. But in fact, this is absolutely nothing compared to what is about to happen. Moment later, Antoine Oudelot, a 15-year-old boy, looks up and sees the monstrance suspended in the air at more than 1.5 meters high, exactly where the priest had displayed it the day before. Basically, the Holy Sacrament, the monstrance containing the consecrated host, is literally levitating. The news spreads quickly, and faithful priests and curious onlookers have flooded the abbey to witness the levitation of the monstrance. Most kneel to worship, as they see in this sign a confirmation that Jesus is present in the Eucharist. Another religious community, the Capuchins of Vesoul, is alerted. They arrive the same day around 5 p.m. Because yes, the monstrance has been levitating since around 3 a.m. And all those who wish have been able to come to witness the miracle. The morning of May 27th, the Capuchins drafted a first report to explain the events. Around 10 a.m., the crowd is surprised by the sound of a vibrating silver blade. The monstrance then begins to move. It gently flows down to the ground, as if carried by an invisible hand, and delicately rests on a cloth that had been spread out below by the cautious monks. The 2 hosts in the monstrance are intact. The number of witnesses, the church is then packed to the brim. Thus, on that day, more than 1,000 people, which is the capacity of the monastery church, came to witness this impressive double miracle. An object weighing several kilograms, the monstrance, levitated in the air, without any human or technical assistance, and for more than 30 hours, which is scientifically impossible. Moreover, the 2 consecrated hosts, as well as the 2 letters, withstood the flames without any natural explanation, since all the surrounding furniture was consumed. Everyone is talking about this in the region. The week following the miracle, 3 judges arrive in Faverney to question 54 witnesses, including 7 monks under oath. The results are clear. Firstly, the investigation was conducted seriously, with written and printed accounts by direct witnesses, ensuring an accurate understanding of the circumstances of the miracle. Secondly, more than 1,000 direct witnesses, from diverse backgrounds, make the idea of a collective hallucination or a conspiracy impossible. Here is a more unusual Eucharistic miracle. January 31st, 1906, in San Andrés de Tumaco, a small island near Colombia. 10:36 a.m., when the ground begins to shake. An earthquake with a magnitude of 8.8 on the Richter scale shakes the island for 10 long minutes. The very devout population spontaneously gathers in front of the church. It is then that a fisherman announces that the ocean is receding far offshore. Everyone grasps the terrifying news. In a moment, a tsunami will crash onto the island, devastating everything in its path. The earthquake was felt along the Pacific coast of Central America and as far as California, but also in Japan. In Tumaco, the damage is considerable, but the worst is yet to come, as it is impossible to escape the impending tsunami disaster. Indeed, Tumaco is a completely flat island. Its highest point is at a height of 2 meters above sea level. Aware that there is no human hope of escaping death, people are seized by panic. One of the priests, Father Larondo, then turns to the sky to ask for help, prays, and he has the intuition that the only barrier that can be opposed to the tsunami is the Eucharist. He enters the church, goes to the tabernacle, he takes the large consecrated host, without taking the time to place it in the monstrance. He will affirm that at that moment, a supernatural peace filled him, convincing him that he truly holds the body of Christ in his hands, and that it can perform any miracle. Turning then to his parishioners, he exclaims, "Let's all go to the beach, my children, and may God have mercy on us." Followed by the entire population, the priest holding up the host sets off in procession towards the beach. There, the crowd sees, a few hundred meters from Tumaco, a gigantic wave over 10 meters high rushing towards the shore. Instinctively, people step back, leaving the priest standing alone facing the tide that will engulf them. Slowly, with solemnity, facing the tsunami, Father Larondo raises the large host with both hands and traces a wide blessing over the tide. Then he remains there, unable to move and disbelieving. Behind him, a cry resounds, echoed in chorus by faithful, "Miracle! Miracle!" The priest then becomes aware of what is happening. Instead of crashing down on him, the colossal wave stopped and remained suspended for a few seconds before retreating towards the ocean, which calms down and gradually returns to its usual appearance. The host is brought back to the church amidst fields of thanksgiving, placed in the monstrance, and the faithful adore it until late at night. This story seems so enormous that it might be understandable to have a few small doubts, if you know what I mean. But in fact, upon researching, I saw, as with the other cases I mentioned earlier, how much more solid and verified it was than I initially thought. In fact, in addition to the numerous testimonies we have, again, a very simple proof that this miracle is authentic is simply that anyone can verify the existence of the earthquake of January 31st, 1906, and considerable damage it caused everywhere else. In Panama, for example, the streets were devastated, ships were propelled out of the harbor, and found in the city center. At least 1,000 deaths are recorded in Colombia and Ecuador. For hundreds of kilometers, the waves spared nothing except Tumaco. This flat island off the coast of Colombia was, however, one of the most exposed points, very close to the epicenter, the place where the tsunami should logically have caused the worst devastation. And yet, absolutely no damage, no trace of the wave's passage, nothing at all, and the villagers all tell the same story. With this host that was held up against the wave, one can only accept that indeed something completely inexplicable happened. Even today, the beach where the miracle took place is still known as Miracle Beach. Well, a consecrated host stopping a tsunami is crazy. But there is also a case where a host stopped a fire. It is November 21, 1770, around 7 o'clock in the morning, when a fire breaks out in a house in Orgelet, France, in the Jura. The fire spreads quickly through the village and reaches the town hall square. Most of the houses being made of wood, one can imagine the panic it must have been. Everyone is busy in the street trying to extinguish the flames. There is notably a convent of Capuchin monks at the other end of Orgelet. Monks watch the disaster helplessly, but one of them, a priest, has an idea. He runs to the church, takes the Holy Sacrament, and goes out into the street, meters from the flames. Upon reaching the Menard family's house, the priest asks for a table to be set up. Once the table is ready, he places the host on it and kneels down. Suddenly, everyone notices that the fire seems to diminish all around, as if the blaze is being extinguished by an invisible power. Many witnesses of the miracle witnessed, and it marked the small town that even today, every year, on November 21st, Orgelet celebrates the procession of the fire. The priest of the church carries the Holy Sacrament through the main street and makes a stop in front of the old Menard house where the devastating fire stopped. And in fact, Eucharistic miracles, which are not simply bread turning into flesh, are numerous. There are also cases where people have reportedly been miraculously healed after receiving communion. For example, I didn't mention that communion is at the end of the Mass, the moment when Catholics eat the consecrated hosts, as they believe Jesus wants to come into them, physically speaking. This is not cannibalism. As for Catholics, Jesus is truly present in the host, but in an invisible way. The host retains the taste of bread, and when Catholics eat the host, it doesn't resemble flesh at all. Well, except during Eucharistic miracles, Catholics do not eat the hosts that have undergone a visible miracle. Anyway, I hope I haven't lost you. We'll talk about it more later. So, I was talking about people who have been instantly healed from serious illnesses after receiving a consecrated host. A well-known historical case took place in France, in La Rochelle, on Easter Day in 1461. On that day, Madame Jeanne Leclerc brings her 12-year-old son Bertrand to the Church of St. Bartholomew. The child, at 7 years old, had become mute and paralyzed after a terrible fall. At the moment of communion, he indicates to his mother that he also wants to receive Jesus in the Eucharist. The priest, a bit hesitant at first, eventually agrees. As soon as Bertrand receives the host, he feels shaken by a mysterious force. Instantly, he can move and speak again. He is healed. A document is then immediately written to commemorate these events, and the manuscript that describes this miracle is still preserved in the Cathedral of La Rochelle. But this kind of healing happened recently in history. For example, several miraculous healings in Lourdes, Jean Fretel in 1948, happened after receiving a consecrated host. Lourdes, south of France, is known for Virgin Mary's 19th century apparitions. Miracles occurred? I will discuss it in a future investigation. Also, there have been times when Eucharistic miracles were filmed, even in some cases while it was broadcast live on television. And indeed, one of these cases took place in Lourdes during a televised mass broadcast live on France 2 for the program Le Jour du Seigneur on November 7, 1999. We are then during an assembly of all the bishops of France, and the mass is celebrated in the large underground basilica of Lourdes Saint-Pédis by three cardinals: Monsignor Lustiger, Archbishop of Paris; Monsignor Billet, Archbishop of Lyon; and Monsignor Eighth, Archbishop of Bordeaux. At the moment of the blessing, one of the hosts begins to levitate 3 semipletis. This lasts for 5 minutes. I will show you the excerpt.
Sanctify these offerings by pouring out your Spirit upon them, that they may become for us. In fact, there are several hosts stacked, and it is therefore the one on top that has levitated.
All over France, people watching the Mass on TV call their loved ones to watch on Channel 2. But in the church, the faithful are too far to see anything, since the three cardinals continue as if nothing were happening. Indeed, they know everything is being filmed, and they will have to account for their reaction before the Pope and the whole world if they do anything inappropriate. They concentrate and continue the Mass. The only live comment that remained was from a cameraman from France 2 who exclaimed, "What is that thing?" Very soon after the Mass, several church authorities of the Lord's Day clarify the mystery. Bishop Lustiger points out that it may be an optical illusion, impossible. The videos we still have today are indeed certainly of poor quality, but they are clear enough to distinctly see the host rising objectively. The hypothesis of a tampering with the video is not to be considered, since the images were indeed broadcast live. Some even suspected the filming crew of having staged a good prank, using some sort of blower that would have lifted the host, but no mechanism of this kind has been discovered. And the technicians from France 2 pointed out, I quote, that they might have had other things to do than this kind of nonsense. Others sought more credible explanations, citing humidity. Since the levitation occurred in an underground basilica, which is humid, the thermal shock from the spotlights may have caused the host below to swell, which by the effect of inflation would have lifted the one above. It's not stupid. However, it is clear that the host below remains perfectly flat, and there is a gap between the two hosts, as we can clearly see the bishop's vestments through this gap between the two hosts. The last hypothesis that some have tried to put forward, and even some Catholics, like priest Jean-Baptiste Renaudot, doctor of science and lecturer at Faculty of Medicine in Montpellier, because yes, unfortunately, Catholics are not gullible, and they try, of course, to explore all possible natural hypotheses before declaring that an event is a miracle, and thus supernatural. Abbé Renaudot explains to us that if positive electric charges appeared on the two inner faces of the hosts, the one above could have lifted, given that two charges of the same sign repel each other, provided, of course, that the unleavened bread is electrifiable. As a result, some attempted to rub hosts with a wool cloth before subjecting them to an electroscope that measures electric charges. No conclusive results. Still, the Catholic Church hasn't officially concluded a miracle happened, let this event pass, and never addressed it. Some Catholics think it's not necessarily a miracle, uncertain. Because of this last hypothesis? After that, note this levitation started precisely at the moment of consecration. Quite a coincidence if it were an electrical phenomenon. It's up to everyone to form their own opinion, and there have been several unusual Eucharistic miracles. For those who want to know more, I recommend this book by Jean-Marie Mathieu, which lists a large number of them. And then, in general, if you want to go further, there is the newsletter edifiant.fr, which offers quality and in-depth content related to the Catholic faith. Subscribe. I will put a link in the description. You will receive an investigative dossier each month with all the evidence inside. To conclude this fourth mysterious mystery, here is one last example for the road that dates back barely 20 years. We are in Germany on November 8, 2004, as 400 people gather in the church of Zevenik, where the Virgin Mary has been appearing for a few years to a mother, Manuela Stark. Around 6:15 p.m., adoration starts. Everyone gathers around the consecrated host to pray. The priest placed the Blessed Sacrament in a new monstrance that had been given to the church 2 years earlier. Inside it, the 12 apostles are painted surrounding the host. After about 10 minutes, suddenly the door of the monstrance seems to have opened by itself, and the host slightly moves backward. Above it, a child with an attractive face appears. For now, only the faithful in the front rows see this miracle. Noticing something unusual, the priest properly repositions the host inside the monstrance, securely closing the door. But he cannot hold back a cry the moment after. The child Jesus has appeared on the consecrated host a meter away from him. In total, about 80 people testified that they clearly and for a long time saw the child Jesus in the monstrance of Zevenik that night. So, between a host that levitates and resists flames in Faverney, another that stops a tsunami in Tumaco or a fire in Orgelet, others that heal in La Rochelle or Lourdes, the original Eucharistic miracles are plentiful, and I believe that the whole, which forms our fourth inexplicable mystery, represents a whole that is very difficult to fully explain by the laws of physics alone, but it's not over. If you weren't convinced until now, look at what happens. We'll show you some extremely recent Eucharistic miracles that I have identified. Some date back only a few years, or even a few months. Our fifth inexplicable mystery will be about extremely well-documented Eucharistic miracles, those of Buenos Aires and Tixtla. It is Friday, May 1st, 1992, in Argentina, in the capital, 982 in Argentina, in the capital, Buenos Aires. That night, in the Church of St. Mary, Carlos Dominguez assists the priest. This is that two pieces of hosts lie before the tabernacle. He thinks that they probably fell from the ciborium when the priest placed them in the tabernacle. According to tradition, when a host falls to the ground, it must be placed in a container of water while waiting for it to decompose. So that's what Carlos does. Then he places the container of water, in this case a ceramic vase, in the tabernacle and goes to bed. A week later, on the morning of May 8th, Brother Juan Salvador Carlomagno, one of the priests of the church, looks into the container for the first time, and there he is taken aback. In the water are three elements, as if one of the hosts had decomposed into two parts. And the three elements look like three clots of blood, with traces of this red liquid also on the edges of the vase, as if the hosts had burst and blood had come out of them. Very quickly, as you might suspect, the effect reaches the hierarchy. The then Bishop of Buenos Aires, Monsignor Antonio Caracino, being absent, it is his auxiliary, a sort of assistant, Monsignor Eduardo Miras, who is informed. He will then request that the samples of hosts be analyzed scientifically. Quite logical. Very quickly, two doctors are then selected for this. First, Dr. Isabel Botto is an oncologist, meaning a specialist doctor who treats people with cancer. She attempts to extract what looks like blood with a syringe and then analyzes it with her laboratory technician, Alicia Martinez. Verdict: it is indeed blood. She even claimed to have seen muscle cells under her microscope. On her side, the other doctor is Mrs. Adelma Miriam Segovia de Sazote, a hematologist at the Ramos Mejia Hospital in Buenos Aires, meaning a specialist doctor in blood diseases. She also confirms the presence of blood, but even more astonishing, she writes in her report about the host sample, "Once when I observed it, I noticed an area that seemed to beat rhythmically. The host seemed to beat as if it were a still living heart. Extremely strange and disturbing, isn't it? Well, I'll skip all the technical details of the various medical reports. Let's move on a bit. In fact, 2 years later, in 1994, another very strange phenomenon will occur in this same church in Buenos Aires. When a person notices traces of blood on a ciborium containing consecrated hosts, but never two without three, and it is in 1996 that a final Eucharistic miracle occurs, on which many analyses will be conducted. On Sunday, August 18th, at the end of the 7 p.m. Mass, a parishioner notices, at the foot of a candlestick in front of a crucifix, a half-hidden host. He shares this, feeling very embarrassed, with the priest, Father Alejandro Pezet. The host had certainly been abandoned by someone with intentions of desecration. The priest hesitates to consume it himself, but it is too dirty and musty. He then asks Emma Fernandez, a 77-year-old woman who usually helps him manage the church, to put it in water and place it in the tabernacle according to the usual procedure. Here we go again. By August 26th, a strange reddish substance appears in the water. The hierarchy is informed. After a month, the remaining foreign material is transferred into a sealed bottle of distilled water and stored safely. Then, nothing happens until 1999, 3 years later. The new Archbishop of Buenos Aires, since the previous year, is none other than Bishop Bergoglio, who does not yet know it, but will become Pope in 2013, Pope Francis. And indeed, he requests new scientific tests to be conducted in July 1999. He then calls upon the independent agency of Dr. Ricardo Castanon Gomez. Dr. Gomez is a clinical psychologist and an expert in psychosomatics, biochemistry, and neuropsychophysiology. He was a former skeptic who looked into many cases of Catholic miracles and eventually converted a few years earlier. He is level-headed. He is neither naive nor a hardcore skeptic who would refuse to believe even in the face of evidence. With the cooperation of Australian television presenter Mike Willesee and director and lawyer Ron Tesoriero, they will film the entire course of the investigation. The interrogations of witnesses and scientists who will study the samples of the host to document everything as thoroughly. On October 21st, 1999, it was lawyer Ron Tesoriero himself who delivered 2 sealed tubes containing the remains of the host to the Forensic Analytical Cream Lab, a medical analysis laboratory in California. One vial has the host from the miracle, 1992, and the other the host from the miracle of 1996. The scientific analyses are done blind, meaning that the researchers studying the host do not know what they are. It means they were just handed the tube and asked to open it and say what they think it is. For example, the label on the second sealed tube simply states this: which means August 26, 1996, wet sample, October 5th, 1999. All these costly investigations were fully funded by the Grupo Internacional para la Paz, an agency founded by Dr. Castanon Gomez himself. Everything is filmed and documented to ensure that at every stage no deception is carried out. Report by Vanorakin, test 1999-441 on 2 samples. 290-441 performed on the 2 samples of 2 samples of human DNA was found, but Dr. Gomez's team wants to go much further and wants to have its results confirmed by other laboratories, still blind. They first send what remains of the 2 samples to Dr. Robert Lawrence of the Delta Pathology Associates Medical Group Laboratory in Stockton, California. He will confirm that the sample is of human origin and will even explain, in a video recorded interview on December 7, 2000, that the white blood cells were active and alive at the time they were collected. Moreover, he stated that the survival of these white blood cells in water without dissolving for more than a few minutes, an hour at most, once separated from the living organism they came from, was simply inexplicable, and yet the samples had remained in water, even distilled water, for more than 3 years. Distilled water, which is water without minerals or salt, prevents life from developing, and yet 3 years later, white blood cells were still alive. Incomprehensible. But Dr. Gomez's team wanted to do things right. They will continue to show the samples to several other scientists. For instance, to these 3 Australian scientists, all of whom confirmed the human origin of the studied substances, which I remind you were originally simple bread hosts, made of wheat flour and water. Ultimately, Dr. Gomez's team wanted a final opinion, who could provide a definitive, authoritative opinion. They then thought of Professor Frederick Zugibe, Chief Medical Examiner and Cardiologist of Rockland County in New York. With his 30 years of experience, he is the author of several scientific discoveries and numerous publications, and has performed 10,000 autopsies to his credit. They meet on April 20th, 2004, and the meeting is filmed. I found the original video seen on the screen. It's Tesoriero holding the camera and Wilsey conducting the interview. Professor Zugibe wants to know the origin of the material to be examined, but the 2 Australians remain silent. Zugibe then examines the samples under the microscope, and these words are recorded. I will show you the entirety of the excerpt that I was able to dub. You'll see it's a bit long, but so enlightening. For those who would like to see the original interview, I will put a link in the description.
Cardiac tissue. There is an inflammatory infiltrate here, but the inflammatory infiltrate is mixed. In fact, it is mixed here. In other words, the cardiac tissue itself is degenerating and is degenerated. In other words, this is what sometimes happens after a heart attack. There's a person who has had a heart attack, but it is not immediate. In other words, the person must have lived for a period of time after that, for at least a few days after that.
Now, indeed, there are other things that can cause these types of elements that resemble a heart attack. In car accidents, where they often, unfortunately, suffer severe chest crushes, and this causes serious damage to the heart, unfortunately. You get it from a person who gets hit in the chest. You know, I have written over 100 articles in cardiology. I was the director of cardiovascular research at the Veterans Hospital. I am a full member of the American College of Cardiology, as well as a forensic pathologist. And the heart is indeed an area that I know. It is my field.
Like Dr. Lawrence before him, Dr. Zugibe indeed confirmed that the white blood cells were alive at the time the sample was taken. A little later, Wilsey asks, how long would these leukocytes survive if the tissue had been placed in water? The answer is the same as that of Dr. Lawrence 4 years earlier. They would dissolve in a few minutes and no longer exist. At that moment, the 2 Australians revealed to Zugibe that the material stayed in tap water for a month in August 1996, and then for 3 years in distilled water.
Another problem is the question of how the heart tissue could have been made to survive in water for 3 years.
This tissue was in water for exactly 3 years. That's absolutely fantastic. Are you sure it was water, not formaldehyde?
We are definitely sure it was water.
It's indeed hard to believe because the tissue here truly shows good fixation. And that would be absolutely remarkably, incredibly, undeniably incredible.
Later, he specifies that after such a long period in water, not only would the white blood cells disappear, but also any other human cells would lose any recognizable morphology. It is only afterwards, to his great astonishment, that he reveals to him that the material came from a consecrated host. The host has thus transformed into a piece of heart that has suffered greatly, Zugibe tells us, and this inevitably brings to mind Jesus on the cross, who died in atrocious suffering. Once again, for those who want it, I will put the entire interview in the description. Sujibe's final report will be released in March 2005. What happened in Buenos Aires alone is so striking, has been so well attested by various scientists, and defies so many laws of physics, that it is enough to be fully convincing that Eucharistic miracles truly exist. Indeed, right here we have at least 3 miracles in one. First, the transformation of the bread into a piece of heart. Second, the fact that this piece of heart has been preserved for several years in distilled water. Thirdly, white blood cells were still alive after years. The most impressive thing is that the Eucharistic miracle of Buenos Aires is just one among many other recent Eucharistic miracles. And the multiplicity of phenomena, their diversity across the globe, is certain. For example, recall the photos I showed you in the introduction? We'll get to that. On October 22, 2006, in Tixtla, Mexico, more than 600 people attended a weekend spiritual retreat led by 2 priests, Leopoldo Roque and Raimundo Reina Esteban, nicknamed Father Rayeto. This Sunday, the Mass is celebrated in a municipal hall, as the 600 people do not fit in the small church of St. Martin. 2 nuns assist in the distribution of the Eucharist during communion, where Catholics approach to receive Jesus present in the consecrated hosts. Suddenly, Sister Aurélie Marroquin, one of the 2 nuns, stops and turns pale in front of the faithful who are in line. She returns to the altar, tears, approaches Father Reito and shows him the ciborium in which one of the hosts is stained with blood. It has a moist and crumbly texture so that when touched gently, a small fragment comes off. Father Reito and Father Leopoldo speak quickly until Father Reito exclaims loudly, "It is a miracle," and he publicly shows the host stained with a few drops of fresh blood to the entire assembly. People are moved, some applaud, others cry. Well, at the point of interest, what concerns us, you and I think, are the scientific analyses that followed. The similarities with the Eucharistic miracles of Buenos Aires are striking, and both are extremely well documented. My desire to group them both in this 5th inexplicable mystery, concrete Eucharistic miracles. Already, the method was the same. It is again the Castanon Gomez team, known for its professionalism and rigor, that has been commissioned to oversee everything. As with Buenos Aires, sealed samples were sent to several independent scientific laboratories, blindly, meaning without informing them that the samples were actually pieces of hosts. After years of investigation, May 25th, 2013, in Sentimentos Auditorium in Chilpancingo, a conference was organized to present the findings of the investigation. It is available on YouTube, and I will also put the link in the description. The conclusions from the laboratories were always the same as in Buenos Aires, as for Lanciano. Firstly, human blood was indeed found. For example, the GenX laboratory in La Paz, Bolivia, confirmed the presence of hemoglobins, a protein found in red blood cells. In the conference, Dr. Susana Pinel is actually shown on screen, conducting the test to detect human hemoglobin. And then, interestingly, 2 separate and distinct studies using different methods ultimately reached the same conclusion. The human blood came from within the host bread. In one of them, Dr. Eduardo Sanchez Lazo, director of the Corporate Forensic Laboratory in Mexico, demonstrated that it was impossible for the blood to have come from outside and wet the surface of the host. I'll skip the technical details, but the other common conclusion from the laboratories was that the blood was of blood type AB. Well, just like on the host of Lanciano. In Buenos Aires, however, the blood type was not investigated. Then, the analyzed sample corresponded again to heart muscle, which would have suffered greatly or undergone trauma. This was the opinion of all the scientists, like Dr. Marco Blanquiche Anaya, a cardiologist at the Nuevo Hospital Boca Grande in Colombia, who believed that the person with this heart had suffered either a heart attack or severe stress. Then, because it's not over, under a layer of coagulated blood, fresh blood was still in contact with the host. Indeed, in February 2010, 4 years after the miracle, engineer Fernando Rodriguez Perez, an imaging expert, came to Tixtla and visited the chapel where the miracle is preserved. He set up his instruments a few meters from the hotel. It included a high-powered digital microscope emitting white and ultraviolet light. His scanning study under the microscope revealed that fresh blood was still present in the stained portion of the host. Under the visibly coagulated surface layer of blood was an impressive discovery, given that more than 3 years had passed since the miracle occurred. The thickness of the host was examined using an infrared light technique, arriving at the same conclusion: the blood came from within. Thus, the question that worried the bishop before the investigations finally found an answer. The red stain was not added by a malicious person, as the blood inexplicably flowed from within the host. Finally, as in Buenos Aires, the last but not least element was the presence of living white blood cells. Once again, white blood cells cannot survive more than a few minutes to a few hours, separated from a living organism and without special preservation techniques. And yet, after more than 3 years, scientists were able to find several living white blood cells, to the point that one of them, called a macrophage, was even captured on a glass slide while doing its job of engulfing fatty debris. In short, The conclusions of the Tixtla miracle closely resemble those of Buenos Aires and are equally impressive. And yet, the miracle took place in another country and was analyzed by other scientists. The miracles of Tixtla and Buenos Aires are therefore extremely well-documented concrete miracles, and they form our fifth inexplicable mystery. But it's not over. Let's now move on to the sixth inexplicable mystery, namely all the other Eucharistic miracles that have occurred in the last 15 years up to today. Yes, Eucharistic miracles continued after 2006. I present a well-documented case that occurred in 2008, another solid one that took place in 2013, and a few probable cases that happened just a few years ago, or even a few months. This time we are in Sokolka, Poland, a small town of 20,000 on October 12, 2008. On Sunday morning, the Church of St. Anthony of Padua, the 8:30 a.m. Mass, is led by Father Filip Strawowski. He is assisted in the distribution of communion by Father Jacek Ingilevich. Of the faithful receiving communion notices a host on the ground. That one of the priests must have dropped a few moments before she arrived. Without saying a word, the lady touches the leg of the priest and with a glance shows him the step where the host is located. The priest picks it up, but since it is dirty, he decides not to consume it, but rather to immerse it in the water of the vasculum, a small silver container used for washing hands that was already on the altar. The host is then carefully and gently moved to a large glass vase the same day and placed in the safe of the sacristy. The sacristy is a room next to the church where priests prepare and where the objects used during the Mass are stored. Well, and there you know the refrain, you can guess what comes next. Later, on October 19th, the sacristan, that is, the one who takes care of the sacristy and all the church's items, Sister Julia Duboshka, opens the safe. She expects that the host has dissolved in the water. She looks into the vase, where the water has remained perfectly clear, but is extremely surprised to find that part of the host hasn't dissolved yet, and is partially covered by a solid, bloody red clot, resembling a bloodstain about 1.5 centimeters in size. Sister Julia immediately calls the priest in charge of the church, Father Stanislav Nijisko, who is also the only one with the key to the safe with her. The bishop will quickly be informed, and they ask that the host be secured. On October 30th, what remains of the host is placed on what is called a corporal, a kind of small cloth. On it, a very visible red cross was embroidered. The host will be removed in mid-January 2009 for analysis. And today, a few years later, you can still see the cloth with the red bloodstain blending with the arms of the embroidered cross. On January 7, 2009, at the request of the bishop, the host is examined. I've noted several interesting things. First of all, 2 experts from the University of Bialystok are chosen to examine the remains of the host. And I have to say, I've rarely seen resumes like these. The first expert, Professor Stanislaw Szulkowski, has published no less than 286 internationally recognized scientific publications on PubMed. PubMed, for those who don't know, is a website where you can find a ton of articles and scientific research on health and medicine. It's kind of like a huge online library for doctors and researchers, and one of the most recognized in the world. The other scientist chosen to examine the host is Professor Maria Elvietia Sobaniec-Lotoshka, and she has over 100 publications on PubMed herself. An interesting detail as well, when Professor Lotoshka takes a small sample of what she thinks looks like a blood clot, since she isn't aware of the sample's origin, a part of the still white host is also present with what she collected, as if it were inseparable from the clot. And there, once again, the conclusions reached independently by the 2 researchers are striking. Their report states, the sample is myocardial tissue, or at least among all the tissues of a living organism, myocardial tissue is the one that resembles it the most. Well, basically, it's a piece of heart, and he specifies that these cardiac muscle cells are from a heart, in the context of imminent death. The first time I read that, I admit I skimmed through it a bit without really understanding, so let me do it again. We're not talking about the heart of a deceased person, but rather a living heart in agony. I wanted this video to be not too technical, so I'm skipping the scientific explanation of that. But for those who want to know more, most of the sources of what I've shared in this video come from the research of a cardiologist, Franco Serafini, who looked into Eucharistic miracles and wrote a book called A Cardiologist Examines Jesus. The French version should be out soon. I'll put all the links in the description. Another incredible thing about this miracle in Sokolka is that the myocardial fibers, meaning the piece of human heart, and the substance of the host, which is basically just wheat flour and water, I remind you, were in contact with each other in an inexplicable way, as if they were intrigued. The high degree of intimate and microscopic interpenetration between the 2 substances is remarkable and simply unachievable by any type of instrument designed by humans and currently available. That's definitely what Professor Latowska pointed out, for whom this was an argument demonstrating the impossibility that this sample could have been created by humans. Finally, just like in Buenos Aires or Tixtla, the mere preservation of the host and the piece of heart in water after all this time is inexplicable. Alright, let's move forward another 5 years. It's now Christmas Day 2013, still in Poland, but this time on the other side of the country in Legnica. There, A similar event to that of Sokolka occurs. A consecrated host falls to the ground and is placed in a chalice with water to dissolve. On January 5th, 2014, a priest notices that a portion of the host, which has turned red, has detached from the rest. The effect goes back to the bishop, Stefan Sishi, who requests scientific analyses, first at the nearby University of Wrocław, and then later, additional tests at the University of Szczecin. What I really like is that the procedures were even more rigorous than those of the Sokolka miracle. So, 15 samples were taken from the fragment of the host, and all the procedures step by step took place in the presence of witnesses and photographers. They even mixed the samples with others from unconsecrated hosts from the same production batch as the miraculous host. Well, if I go over all the scientists' conclusions again, my video might end up being a bit repetitive. So you won't hold it against me, but I'm going to keep it short this time. Anyway, you know what to read if you want to dig deeper. Basically, unsurprisingly, the conclusions were always the same as elsewhere. Presence of human blood and heart muscles corresponding to a living person's heart in agony. In short, in every way inexplicable, incomprehensible. Today, the remains of the host have been placed, just like in Sokolka, on a corporal cloth. In addition to Buenos Aires, Tixtla, Sokolka, and Legnica, we also had hosts that bled in Guadalajara, Mexico in 2013. See for yourself. But Eucharistic miracles continue even today. Indeed, even though they are quite rare, considering the many masses daily worldwide, they occur often. For example, on November 30th, 2018, in Springbrook, near Buffalo, USA, at St. Vincent de Paul Church, a priest notices once again a host turned into a red clot sea after days in a vase of water. Except this time, the effect goes up to the hierarchy. The local bishop, Mr. Richard Malone, doesn't want to hear about it and orders the remains of the host to be destroyed. There will be quite a scandal because of this, and many Catholics will be outraged, since for them, it's really Jesus who is present in the host, so it's something horrible to destroy the remains, and also because we might have missed the recognition of another Eucharistic miracle. But this at least shows, despite expectations, that the church hierarchy is not in a hurry to recognize miracles. We had something incredible. It pulls the recognition of a potential miracle. The church as an institution is often very hesitant about any supernatural phenomenon. But anyway, even more recently, in 2023, still in the United States, in Thomaston, on March 5th, during a mass, one of the people giving communion missed the host, and there was said to be a multiplication of hosts. It may sound strange, but this has already happened in history. Anyway, the priest decided to make a little statement at the end of the mass that was filmed. Put it on. We'll talk about it later.
Hard to say, in a way, to be honest, when you think about it, it's God who offers us in mysterious ways, and it's funny how God offers us. Sometimes it happens in a strange, inexplicable, mysterious, mystical, and odd way, and one of our Eucharistic ministers missed a host during the distribution process. And they didn't do it, as they were expected to do so, however, and quite unexpectedly and surprisingly, there were a significant number of additional hosts in the ciborium. God duplicated it himself in a manner and the continued support. God provides it. It's strange how God does that. And it happened, and it was carefully observed by one of our Eucharistic ministers, as you may have noticed, who gave you communion today. It's really, really cool that God does these things. And it's really, really cool when we realize what he has done. And it happened today in a way that was truly and undeniably very powerful, incredibly awesome, very real, and undeniably very shocking. But also it happened, and today it happened. They were in the process of taking out a host, and all of a sudden, more hosts were there. So today, not only do we have the miracle of the Eucharist, but we actually have a greater miracle.
Well, as you can see, we definitely have less tangible evidence than for some of the other miracles I've presented to you before. But again, one has to wonder what reason this priest would have to lie. Especially since he will have to answer to his superiors. And as we've seen, some bishops are very skeptical about the supernatural. So he knows he risks heavy sanctions if he says anything false. Finally, the last example, the most recent one I found at the time I'm making this video, as it supposedly took place in March 2024 in Shumukadima, India. Everything I'm saying is based on an interview with the priest of the church, Father Johnson Vadakapurathan, so again, let's be cautious. There hasn't been an official investigation yet. It all started a few months ago, during a mass. At the time of communion, a woman left with a consecrated host, which is normally strictly forbidden. It has to be consumed on the spot and in front of the priest. But discreetly, she managed to leave with it. Once she got home, she starts feeling guilty. She has a guilty conscience. She then talks about it with a Catholic friend who actually advises her to return the host to the church immediately. She then contacts a nun who retrieves the host and hands it over to Father Johnson. As usual, following the standard procedure for hosts that haven't been properly consumed, places the host in water to let it dissolve. Usually, it only takes a few days, but after that time, the host is still intact. The priest decides to wait a few more days, but the host still shows no signs of dissolving. On March 24, 2024, a week before Easter, Father Johnson checks again and discovers that the water has turned dark and a crust has formed on the host. As he tries to break the crust, a substance resembling fresh blood comes out. The priest, shocked, concludes that he is witnessing an exceptional phenomenon. He immediately informs his bishop, Mr. James Topple, who could, if he wishes, launch an investigation with scientific analysis. To be continued. In any case, today we have photos of this phenomenon, which could very well be the most recent Eucharistic miracle we have. Actually, no, I had finished recording this video. And now, a few months later, you see, I'm in my new studio. But there was an even more recent Eucharistic miracle just a few weeks ago that I had to tell you about. It was Saturday, August 10th, 2024, at the San Joaquin Parish in Bogota, Colombia. There, 300 people attended a time of adoration of the Blessed Sacrament led by Father Ruvel Zuluaga Agustino, and watch what happened when the priest entered with the Blessed Sacrament to place it on the altar. The host, located at the center of the monstrance, started to beat intensely like a heart beating. A parishioner was able to spontaneously film the scene. You can clearly see Lossi beating. Father Zuluaga, very moved, started to cry, and for many minutes, the 300 participants were able to witness the miracle. Many people cried tears of emotion. In short, if you've been following along, Eucharistic miracles are extremely frequent and diverse for centuries. And yet, when you take a closer look, there are indeed many well-documented and very solid cases, in a word, perfectly inexplicable according to the laws of physics as we know them. But before we wrap up this investigation, let's look at a seventh inexplicable mystery that concerns Eucharistic miracles in the lives of saints and mystics. For 2,000 years, there have been many Catholics known as saints. So saints are men and women who are madly in love with God and Jesus, who lived only for Him, and who throughout their lives showed an exemplary love for God and for others. So, when a Christian dies and has clearly lived a holy life, the Catholic Church can choose after their death to canonize them, meaning to officially declare them a saint. So Catholics believe that the saints are still alive in heaven with God. But there are also saints who are not recognized, not officially recognized by the Church. Well, yes, there are a lot of people who die in obscurity, but who were still true friends of God. In any case, the saints officially recognized by the Catholic Church were often people deeply in love with Jesus present in the Eucharist. Do you remember Carlo Acutis, the one I mentioned in the introduction? I was telling you he was a young man, wise and deeply loved God. At just 15 years old, he created a major exhibition on Eucharistic miracles. Loving the Eucharist, he went to Mass every day. And here's one of the things he said one day while he was in the car with his family on a highway. The Eucharist is the highway to heaven. The more we receive communion, the more we will become like Jesus. And even here on earth, we will have a taste of paradise. If we approach the Eucharist every day, we're heading straight to heaven. When we stand in front of the sun, we get a tan. When we stand before Jesus in the Eucharist, we become saints. And he, who at such a young age, so precocious, already had a crazy love for Jesus present in the host, and who passed away so early, at just 15 years old, in 2006, was indeed canonized by the Catholic Church. This means that he is recognized as a saint by the Church, particularly for his love of the Eucharist. Now, some saints were true mystics, meaning that miracles were frequent in their lives and many people who were close to them were able to testify to that. Well, I'll soon do an investigation specifically on this topic, the supernatural phenomena in the lives of mystics, to see if it's well documented or not. But for now, for this seventh mystery, I can already share with you many anecdotes about inexplicable Eucharistic phenomena that have occurred in the lives of saints and mystics. For example, it's said that Saint Francis of Assisi in the 13th century, who loved creation so much because he loved the Creator, had a special affection for little sheep. One day, while he was at the Portiuncula, which is the little church in Assisi that he had renovated, a sheep was brought to him. Amused, he had her join in the prayer with the other monks. And everyone was deeply amazed to see, at the moment of the consecration during the Mass, the sheep bowing down, its knees bent as if it were adoring the Eucharist. Around the same time, another story involving animals is sure to make us smile. Saint Anthony of Padua was then discussing the presence of Jesus in the Eucharist with someone who didn't believe in it. This skeptic challenged him to prove that the true body of Christ is present in the consecrated host and promised success he would convert to the Catholic faith. The skeptic said to Saint Anthony, "I will lock my mule in the stable for several days without giving it any food." I will then bring her out to the square in front of everyone, showing her some fodder. In the meantime, you will place the host in front of the mule. If the animal kneels before the host, ignoring the fodder, I will convert. The saint showed the host to the mule, which knelt in, by the virtue and in the name of the Creator that I, though unworthy, hold in my hands, tell you, animal, and I command you to approach with humility and to give the veneration that is due to it. As soon as Anthony had spoken these words, the mule, despite being hungry, ignored the food, lowered its head, approached him, and knelt before the Eucharist in front of a large number of witnesses who had gathered to see the outcome of this challenge. There are plenty of anecdotes like this in history, but I know you want more recent things. As I told you, more recent doesn't necessarily mean more verified, but okay, I'll give you quite a few more convincing examples that took place in the 20th century. It's September 1941, and Mother Yvonne Aimée de Malétroit, a Catholic mystic, is on her way to visit monasteries in Normandy and stops at La Bradière. There, she visits Father Paul Labute, who has recently been repatriated from a labor camp in Bavaria. After several days of traveling on rocky paths, she finally arrives at this large, dilapidated building where she is warmly welcomed. One afternoon, while taking a walk in the small woods with Father Labute, Mother Yvonne Aimée feels an intense spiritual pain. She has a vision of a consecrated host being profaned, pierced by a punch and bleeding. Overwhelmed with great distress, she fervently prays for Jesus to return the host to her. Miraculously, a light appears above the trees, and a bloodied host gently descends to rest on a branch within reach. But Rivenemé loses his footing, stunned, and retrieves the host, placing it on a green leaf as a corporal. You remember the little liturgical cloth. Mother Yvonne Aimée photographs the host on the branch, puts in a small cabin as a chapel at the foot of a statue of the Virgin Mary. In the evening, the cabin is lit by candles that light up on their own. Mother Yvonne Aimée spends the night in adoration before the host, feeling an intense spiritual connection. This miracle is confirmed by the photographs you can see on the screen and the testimonies of those who were present. The photos clearly show the bloodied host, and these images were taken immediately after the events by Mother Yvonne Aimée herself. By the way, speaking of photographed miracles, we also have another example from Garabandal in Spain, 1962. There, 4 little girls claim to be visited by the Virgin. Since May, an angel would give them communion when no priest is present. Even though the pilgrims see the movements of the little girls, the host remains invisible. But everything changes on July 18th. That day, around like 2:30 in the morning, a large crowd gathered in an alley near Conchita's house. The 4 children announced that that night, the host would be visible during Conchita's communion. José Dier, a 45-year-old Mason, keeps an eye on her at her mother's request, fearing that the crowd might crush her. Conchita, her cousin Lucia, watches the celebration outside. She falls into ecstasy, descends, and steps out into the street. She kneels, smiles, and opens her mouth, sticking out her tongue. The crowd, which doesn't take its eyes off her, then sees a host appear on her tongue, clear and well-formed. They are struck by the immediacy of the appearance. Conchita's tongue stays still, dry and clean, and suddenly the host is there. The host remains visible on Conchita's tongue as if it's resting on a plate. As the minutes go by, it grows larger and seems alive, shining from within, changing in size. Photographs will even be taken, as you can see on the screen. The church has never made a definitive statement on the events of Garabandal, so it's probably wise to stay cautious, but I will look into this topic again sooner or later. By the way, this kind of Eucharistic miracle, where an angel brings communion to a believer, hasn't only happened in Garabandal. This kind of phenomenon happened frequently to several mystics, like Sister Marie-Bertine Vauquillon in the 19th century, Rosalie Pout or Teresa Palminotta in the early 20th century, and more recently to the French Saint Foros Chopin, who passed away in 1983. And then in a vein, like the miraculous communion captured in photos, we have the events in Naju, South Korea, starting in 1995, where 19 Eucharistic miracles are to have occurred around the Virgin of Tears, an apparition that took place with Julia Kim. One of them took place on September 22nd, 1995, at the Mountain of the Virgin of Tears, located 20 kilometers south of the city. Bishop Roman Danilak, accompanied by Father Aloysius Chang Hongbin, celebrates an outdoor mass in the presence of Julia and many faithful. During this mass, an incredible transformation takes place. During communion, Bishop Danilak gives a host to Julia, which immediately transforms into living flesh, gradually taking the shape of a bloody heart. The crowd is stunned, and the witnesses, including Father Joseph Finn, watch as the host changes into flesh and blood. There have been several photos that you can see on the screen. After the Mass, Julia shares that she had trouble swallowing the host because of its thickness and consistency. She also tastes blood in her mouth. Bishop Danilak, impressed, asks Julia to drink some water from the nearby miraculous spring. A little blood is visible on her finger coming from the corner of her lips. This miracle is confirmed by sworn testimonies, including that of Bishop Danilak, who certifies the transformation of the host. He considers these events as private revelations, which basically means that you don't have to believe in them. But he emphasizes that the Eucharistic phenomena observed are real events, noticeable by a large number of witnesses, including several bishops. A second miracle also occurs, the instant healing of a woman suffering from a painful illness. These supernatural events, backed by photographic and video evidence, strengthen the faith of believers and testify to the power of the Eucharist. And in the months and then the years that follow, nearly 20 other phenomena of this kind will occur. Once again, no definitive statement from the Church. You just have to be cautious. There are also several mystics who seem to only feed on the Eucharist. For example, there's Therese Neumann, a 20th century German Catholic mystic who reportedly didn't eat for over 30 years. She regularly had ecstasies in which blood would come out of her, as if she were reliving the sufferings of Jesus on the cross. And it's true that her case was closely monitored by several doctors. In 1927, she was monitored for 14 days and nights, didn't absorb or drink except for a small portion of host each day. The craziest part is that her weight was the same at the beginning and at the end of the experience. You can possibly go 14 days without eating, but definitely not without drinking, and certainly not without losing weight. But in reality, what proves that she wasn't eating anything is probably the fact that thousands of visitors continuously visited her throughout her life. And as silly as it sounds, it has to be said, no one ever saw her eat, buy food, or even, to be honest, go to the bathroom. When asked what she lived on, she would reply, "The Redeemer." In fact, she received communion very regularly, and on the other hand, when for one reason or another she couldn't receive the host because the priest was absent, she would completely weaken, as if the host truly contained her daily vital energy. I'll do a full investigation on the cases of mystics who lived without eating. You'll see that there have been many well-documented cases, so subscribe so you don't miss it. Many mystics also sometimes receive the host supernaturally during communion. The host would then start flying from the priest's hands and go directly into the mouth of the person receiving communion. This kind of phenomenon happened, for example, to a French nun from Albi in the 17th century, Sister Marie-Angélique de la Grave. Witnesses spoke about her. On Christmas Eve in 1683, as this dear sister approached the grill to receive communion, the host slipped from the priest's hand and placed itself on her lips. The nun who was following her witnessed the miracle, as did several people who were in the church. The news spread quickly through the city, and the priest who witnessed the event publicly confirmed it. More recently, we also have about 10 testimonies from priests who claim to have felt the host slip from their fingers and go directly into the mouth of Marthe Robin, a 20th century mystic. But examples of remote communion are common, even in recent times, and to get the sources for what I'm telling you, you should read the excellent book by Joachim Boufflet, The Encyclopedia of Extraordinary Phenomena in Mystical Life, in 3 volumes. Amazingly, some mystics have even drunk the wine from the chalice at a distance, which turns into the blood of Christ according to Catholics. So, a priest testifies about Saint Mary Françoise of the Five Wounds, an Italian saint from the 18th century. She would sometimes take very little, just a few drops, but that was enough to make me question her and confirm the fact. One time when she almost drank half of it, I noted the undeniable absence of part of the chalice's contents and was shocked. This was also the case for Maria Grazia Tarallo, a nun who passed away in 1912. Here's testimony of one close one. One day, Sister Maria was glowing, and I asked her what new wonders had happened to her. She replied, "The confessor was scared this morning when he took back the chalice at Mass. He saw that the wine had decreased and looked to see if any had spilled on the altar. But it was useless. I had drunk it and left very little in the chalice, but I don't know how all of this happened." In reality, the supernatural Eucharistic phenomena in the lives of saints and mystics are so numerous that I could fill an investigation of over 2 hours just with them. Let me know in the comments if this topic interests you, and after all, why not? I might make another video about it. All you can take away for now is the immense diversity of these phenomena. At all times, in all countries, among men and women who love God, there has been a great love for Jesus present in the Eucharist. Well, at the end of this investigation it might sound funny, but I'm almost a bit disappointed because I feel like I've only scratched the surface. I assure you, it was incredibly frustrating. I've discovered cases. You'll find many more verified cases. But in reality, be sure that if you want to dig, you will discover many other extremely solid and attested cases. Honestly, there are so many, it's mind-blowing. And finally, even though I've only talked about a few cases, given all the evidence we have and that I've presented to you, it seems more than likely that Jesus is truly present in the consecrated host. The arguments I've presented to you are already more than enough if we're honest with ourselves and accept reality. In fact, Jesus said it very explicitly during his life, and I'd like to read you this passage from the Gospel of John chapter 6. Stay with me until the end. Don't leave just yet, because the most important part is coming up. So to start, I'll read you the passage. Jesus answered them, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry. Whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. But I've already told you you've seen it, and yet you don't believe." And a little further on, I am the bread of life. In the desert, your ancestors actually ate the manna and they died. But the bread that comes down from heaven is such that whoever eats it will not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats this bread, he will live forever. The bread that I will give is my flesh, given for the life of the world. Amen, amen. I tell you indeed, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you do not truly have life in you. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up on the last day. Indeed, my flesh is the true food, and my blood is the true drink. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me, and I in him. Just as the living Father sent me and I live because of the Father, so whoever eats me will also live because of me. Such is the bread that came down from heaven. It's not like the one that the ancestors ate. They died. Whoever eats this bread will live forever. On July 8, 1935, André Frossard, a 20-year-old young journalist, accidentally pushes open the door of a chapel in Paris. He was raised in atheism by his father, Louis Oscar Frossard, a communist and Freemason. So André is ultra-skeptical and indifferent to the idea of God. As he enters the chapel, he sees an intense light coming from the Blessed Sacrament. This brightness transforms into a penetrating spiritual light. 10 minutes later, as he was leaving, he tells his friend, "I am Catholic." In an instant, before Jesus in the host, he felt his real presence and he converted. This encounter with God is so powerful that he would later declare, "I met him like one meets a plane tree." And he wrote a book sharing his testimony, "God exists. I met him," before entering the French Academy in 1987. Yet he was absolutely not naive or gullible, and his total instantaneous conversion without any hesitation until the end of his life is therefore further proof of Jesus' presence in the Blessed Sacrament. The key is a personal encounter with Jesus, the host. It can really strengthen our faith that Jesus is present in the Eucharist. But what really matters now, the only thing that counts, is to have that personal encounter with Jesus present in the consecrated host. What matters is to have our own relationship with the Eucharist. Because if God himself is present in such a tiny piece of bread, then we can't overlook that. It's the most important thing that can exist on earth. But some might be wondering why. Why did Jesus want to come in a simple host of bread? Because in this investigation, I simply provided rational arguments that show that it's indeed the case that Jesus is truly present in the host. But why would he do that? Why would God come in a tiny piece of bread in such a hidden way that no one pays attention to it, and even some Catholics don't believe in it? Why does Jesus remain present in these hosts, locked away in a tiny dark tabernacle in churches that sometimes no one comes to visit? And indeed, if we don't understand the theological reason behind it, it seems to make no sense, let's be honest. Well friends, in this video, my goal was to introduce you to Eucharistic miracles, which are mysteries that science can't explain, not to do theology. So, for those who want to go further, for those who want to know why Jesus wanted to be present in the consecrated host, I direct you to a complete course I created on spiritual life. You'll find the link in the description and in the pinned comment. And here's a little trailer for the course for those who are interested. In Module 3, which will be released very soon, you'll learn why Jesus wanted to come in the host and how to develop your relationship with the Eucharist. Don't miss out. It could completely transform your life. Think about subscribing here, and if you want to see another documented case of a miracle where the Virgin appeared in front of 1 million people, it's right here. Alright, we'll see each other next week for more miracles. See you soon, friends.